It started with the notes. Simple, handwritten pieces of paper folded neatly and left on the windshield of my car. At first, I thought it was just some neighborhood prank, some bored kid trying to pass the time. The first note said, "You look beautiful in red." That day, I'd worn a red scarf. Coincidence? Maybe. But then the notes kept coming. "I love your smile. You shouldn't walk alone at night. I'm always watching." I remember the night I called my best friend Amanda about it. She laughed it off. "It's probably some guy with a crush," she said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Something about the shaky handwriting and the fact that I never saw anyone leave the notes, it felt wrong. And whoever it was, they knew too much about me. It wasn't long before the notes escalated. One night, I got home from work exhausted and ready to collapse on the couch. I walked into my apartment and froze. My favorite coffee mug, one I always left on the counter, was missing. In its place was a single rose lying across the countertop. My stomach churned. I lived alone. My front door had been locked and there were no signs of forced entry. I called the police immediately, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints, no cameras in my building. The officer's face was kind but indifferent. He handed me a card, told me to call if it happened again. That night, I didn't sleep. The next few weeks were a blur of paranoia. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, and started avoiding the places I used to love. No more late-night walks to the corner store, no more jogs in the park. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every sound made me jump. Then came the first phone call. It was around 2 a.m. I woke up to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Groggy, I answered without looking at the number. "Hello?" I said. Silence. "Who is this?" A low chuckle crackled through the line, sending shivers down my spine. "You're even prettier when you're scared," the voice whispered. The line went dead. I sat in my bed, trembling. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but I didn't even know where to start. The police would think I was crazy. Amanda was out of town, and my parents would just worry. The calls didn't stop. Every night, the same time, the same voice. Sometimes he'd laugh, other times he'd describe what I was wearing. The worst was when he started telling me about my day, where I'd been, who I'd talked to. He knew everything. One evening, I decided I'd had enough. I went to stay with Amanda, hoping that being in someone else's home would make me feel safe. It didn't. That night, the calls came again. Amanda answered this time, yelling into the phone, demanding to know who it was. The voice simply said, "You can't protect her," before hanging up. The next morning, Amanda found a note on her car. It read, "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." She begged me to go to the police again, but what could I say? That I was being followed by someone who never left a trace? That this person seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once? I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, one night, it got worse. I was back at my apartment, trying to pretend everything was normal. But I'd locked every door and window, checked my cameras, and left all the lights on. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It said, "Look outside." My heart hammered in my chest as I crept toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything. The street was quiet, empty. But then I noticed him. A man standing across the street, just under the glow of a street lamp. He was tall, wearing a black hoodie that hid his face. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring up at my window. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area, checked my cameras, but there was no sign of him. After that, I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and moved into a motel on the edge of town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Amanda. I thought if I disappeared, he wouldn't be able to find me. I was wrong. It was my third night at the motel when I woke up to a knock at the door. My stomach sank. It was nearly 3 a.m. and I hadn't ordered anything or invited anyone over. I stayed in bed, frozen, hoping whoever it was would go away, but the knocking continued, louder this time. And then, the voice. "Open up, sweetheart, I just want to talk." It was him. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as I backed away from the door. I whispered my address to the operator, trying to stay calm. The knocking turned into pounding, and I could hear him laughing. "You can't hide from me forever," he called. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I held my breath, listening. Minutes passed in silence. Then a shadow moved under the crack of the door. He was still there, waiting. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints outside the door. Just a single note slipped under the frame. It read, "You'll never be rid of me. I don't know how I've made it this far. It's been months since that night at the motel. I've moved 3 times, changed my number, deleted all my social media, but somehow he always finds me. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, or I'll find things moved in my apartment. Small, subtle changes that only I would notice. And then there are the dreams. In them, he's standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with eyes I can't see but can feel. I wake up drenched in sweat, the feeling of his presence lingering long after I've opened my eyes. I don't know what he wants or why he chose me. All I know is that he's out there, somewhere, waiting. And no matter how far I run, he always seems to be one step ahead. If you're hearing this, be careful. Pay attention to the little things. A missing mug, a moved chair, a note that seems out of place. Don't brush it off like I did, because once he's in your life, he never really leaves.
Story number 2.
It started on a cold October night, the kind where the wind howls through the cracks in the windows and the streets seem emptier than usual. I had just moved into my new apartment, a small, run-down studio on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was cheap and mine. I'd been there for less than a week when I first noticed something strange. It was around 11 p.m., and I was unpacking a box of books when I heard a knock on the door. Not a loud, urgent knock, just 3 soft taps. I paused, heart racing. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't know anyone in the building. Slowly, I approached the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a flickering light bulb. I opened the door a crack, but there was no one there. Just the quiet hum of the hallway light and the faint sound of wind outside. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was a kid playing a prank, and went back to unpacking. The next night, it happened again. 3 soft knocks, right at 11 p.m. This time, I didn't open the door. I stood there, staring through the peephole, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was on the other side. But once again, the hallway was empty. I was starting to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the knocks, it was the way they were always the same, soft and deliberate. I told myself it was probably just some weirdo in the building, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The third night was when everything changed. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the knocks came. 3 soft taps, right on schedule. My stomach twisted in fear, but I forced myself to get up and look. This time, I grabbed a kitchen knife before approaching the door. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see the same empty hallway. But this time, I saw something. A man. He was standing just outside the door, his face inches from the peephole. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken and hollow, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He was smiling, a thin, crooked smile that sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager. I told him about the knocks and the man I'd seen. He frowned, scratching his head. "That's strange," he said. "You're the only one living on that floor right now. The other apartments are empty." Empty? I felt sick. There was no way that man should have been there. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I even shoved a chair under the doorknob for extra security. I told myself it was fine, that the man was just some drifter or a figment of my imagination. But then, at 11 p.m., the knocks came again. 3 soft taps, slow and deliberate. I froze. I didn't go to the door this time. I stayed in bed, clutching the knife, my ears straining to hear anything else. The knocks stopped after a minute, and I let out a shaky breath. And then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It read, "Why won't you open the door?" I dropped the phone, my blood turning to ice. How did he get my number? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a joke, someone messing with me. But the fear in my gut told me otherwise. The text kept coming. "I know you're awake. It's rude to ignore your guest. I'm not going anywhere." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I sat there, trembling, waiting for it to stop. Eventually the messages did, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. I started staying out late, sitting in 24-hour diners or driving aimlessly around town just so I wouldn't have to go home. But no matter where I went, the texts followed. "You can't hide forever. Come home. I'm waiting." One night I came back to find my apartment door open. Just a crack, but enough to know someone had been inside. I stepped in cautiously, gripping my knife. The apartment was dark and silent, but something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. All my furniture had been moved. The couch was against the opposite wall, the bed was pushed into the corner, and my belongings were scattered across the floor. On the coffee table was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I opened it with shaking hands. I like what you've done with the place. That was the last straw. I packed a bag and left that night, moving in with a friend across town. I reported everything to the police, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of a crime. I thought it was over. I really did. For a few weeks, things were quiet. No knocks, no texts, no strange occurrences. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd escaped him. Then one night, I woke up to a sound. 3 soft taps. Not at the door, at the window. I live on the 3rd floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, staring at the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping came again, louder this time. Slowly, I turned my head. He was there, on the other side of the glass. His pale face pressed against the window, that same crooked smile stretched across his lips. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, running for the door. When I looked back, he was gone. I don't know how he found me. I don't know what he wants. But no matter where I go, he always seems to be one step ahead. And now, every night at 11 p.m., I hear those knocks. 3 soft taps, waiting.
Story number 3.
I used to work the night shift at a small gas station just outside of town. It was quiet most nights, which I didn't mind. I liked the stillness, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the way the cold air outside pressed against the windows like a phantom. The station was on a stretch of road that didn't see much traffic after dark. A few truckers would stop by, maybe the occasional local looking to grab cigarettes or a soda. Most of the time, it was just me and the endless hours stretching before dawn. I was used to the quiet, but one night, the quiet felt different. It started around 2 a.m. I was leaning on the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed a car pull into the lot. It was an old sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. The headlights stayed on, casting long shadows across the pavement, but no one got out. I waited, watching through the glass. The engine wasn't running, and the car didn't move. It just sat there, the headlights beaming into the store like 2 unblinking eyes. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone was tired, pulling over for a rest. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease in my chest grew. Finally, I decided to step outside and check. Grabbing my flashlight, I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The cold night air bit at my skin as I walked toward the car. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You okay in there?" No response. I approached the driver's side window, tapping on the glass. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the car. It was empty. There was no driver, no passenger, no sign that anyone had ever been inside. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The car door was locked and the windows were fogged slightly, as if someone had been sitting inside just moments ago. I shined my flashlight around the lot, searching for any sign of movement, but the night was still. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. For a while, I just stood there, staring out at the car. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. A ghostly relic stranded in the middle of the lot. Then the phone rang. I jumped, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It was the landline, an old rotary phone mounted on the wall behind the counter. I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling. "Hello?" There was no answer. Instead, I heard a faint static like the sound of a distant storm. And then a voice. "I see you." It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of terror down my spine. I slammed the phone down, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I looked out the window again. The car was still there, its headlights blazing into the store. But now something was different. The fog on the windows had cleared, and in its place were handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the glass from the inside. I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, someone messing with me. But then the lights in the store flickered, and I wasn't alone anymore. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the glass, but as I turned, I saw it, just for a moment. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the aisle. It was tall, its form indistinct, like smoke trying to hold a human shape. I blinked, and it was gone. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into darkness for a heartbeat before humming back to life. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears as I scanned the aisles, searching for any sign of the figure. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the baseball bat we kept behind the counter and stood there, gripping it tightly, waiting for something to happen. The ringing stopped after a few seconds, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerators in the back. I glanced outside. The car was gone. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. Maybe it was over. Maybe whoever, or whatever, had been messing with me had decided to move on. And then I heard it. 3 soft knocks. Not at the door, not at the windows, at the back of the store. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from the storage room. I didn't want to go back there, but I couldn't just stand there, waiting. Gripping the bat tightly, I moved toward the storage room door. It was slightly ajar, the faint glow of the overhead lights spilling into the main store. I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. But there, on the floor, was something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was an old, faded picture of the gas station, taken years ago. The building looked newer, the lot free of cracks and weeds. But in the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure standing near the pumps. Tall, shadowy, and indistinct. I dropped the photo and backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't care about finishing my shift. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and ran out to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The gas station faded into the distance, its fluorescent lights flickering like a dying star, and standing in the middle of the lot, watching me go, was the figure from the photo. It didn't move. It didn't chase me. It just stood there, waiting. I quit that job the next day. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear the knock. 3 soft taps like a ghost calling from the past.
Story number 4.
I've always loved camping. There's something calming about being out in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature. At least, that's what I thought before that trip. It was late September, and a few friends and I decided to head up to the mountains for a weekend getaway. There were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Lucas, his girlfriend Sarah, her cousin Emily, and a guy named Matt that Emily had invited. We reached the campsite just before sunset, a secluded spot deep in the forest. The air was crisp, the sky painted with streaks of orange and pink. We set up our tents, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and telling ghost stories. Ironic, I know. The first night passed without incident. I slept like a rock, the cool mountain air lulling me into a deep sleep. But the second night was different. It started with the noises. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of twigs snapping outside my tent. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or some other small animal scavenging for food. But then I heard it again, a distinct crunch, like footsteps moving slowly through the underbrush. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Lucas?" I whispered, hoping it was him. No answer. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. Everything was still. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The figure didn't respond. I ducked back inside my tent, my mind racing. Maybe it was a hiker, lost and looking for help. Or maybe it was something worse. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag and shone it through the thin fabric of the tent. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from just outside my tent, I heard it. A low, raspy whisper. "I see you." I screamed, stumbling out of the tent, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. My friends were already awake, scrambling out of their tents, their faces pale and confused. "What the hell is going on?" Lucas demanded, his voice shaking. "There's someone out there," I said, pointing toward the trees. We all stood there, listening. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. Then Emily gasped, pointing toward the fire pit. The figure was there, standing on the opposite side of the dying fire. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, gangly limbs and a face that seemed wrong, like it didn't quite fit together. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the embers like twin flames. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Sarah let out a strangled cry, and the thing tilted its head as if amused. And then it was gone. One moment it was standing there, and the next it had vanished into the shadows. We didn't waste any time. We packed up what little we could carry and left the campsite, leaving the tents and most of our gear behind. None of us wanted to stay a second longer. We hiked back to the car in silence, the beam of our flashlights bouncing off the trees. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing following us. When we finally reached the car, the relief was palpable. We piled in, Lucas behind the wheel, and sped down the narrow dirt road as fast as we could. But the nightmare wasn't over. About halfway down the mountain, the car's headlights flickered. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the middle of the forest. "Are you kidding me?" Lucas muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine clicked but wouldn't start. We sat there, the darkness pressing in around us. I tried to tell myself it was just bad luck, that the car breaking down had nothing to do with what we'd seen. But then we heard it. The footsteps. Coming from the woods, slow and deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. Sarah started crying, her sobs muffled by her hands. "It's here," she whispered. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the car. I don't know why I looked. Maybe it was morbid curiosity or some primal need to face the thing that was hunting us. But I turned my head toward the window, and there it was. Its face was pressed against the glass, its features distorted and inhuman. It grinned at me, a wide, toothy smile that stretched impossibly far. I screamed, and the thing vanished again, melting into the darkness like smoke. Lucas tried the engine one more time, and to our shock, it roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and we tore down the road, not stopping until we reached the safety of a small diner at the edge of town. We stumbled inside, disheveled and terrified. The waitress gave us strange looks as we huddled in a booth, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Did you see that thing?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded. "What was it?" Emily asked. None of us had an answer. Eventually the sun rose, and we drove back to the city in silence. We never went back for our gear, and we never talked about that trip again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling just outside my window. And I know it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 5.
I've never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been the rational one, the person who explains away strange noises as the wind or the house settling. But what happened to me last winter has changed everything. It started with a wrong number. I was working late one night, sitting in my cramped apartment surrounded by paperwork, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Are you home?" I frowned, assuming it was someone who had the wrong contact. I texted back, "I think you've got the wrong number." Almost immediately, I got another reply, "No, I don't." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. It had to be a joke, someone messing with me. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to my work, but the messages didn't stop. "I see you. Your window looks so warm." My apartment was on the 3rd floor, the only window facing the street. I glanced over, but the curtains were drawn. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever was texting me knew where I lived, or at least wanted me to think they did. I tried to ignore it, but my phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo. The picture was taken from outside my building, looking up at my window. I bolted out of my chair, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone was outside. I rushed to the window and yanked the curtain aside, but the street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. I locked the window, double-checked the door, and tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was a prank, some random creep trying to scare me. But then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on my front door. I froze. My apartment had a heavy metal door and a narrow peephole. I crept toward it, my hands shaking, and peered out. No one was there. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty hallway. Then I heard it again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing from the bedroom. I didn't want to go in there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the apartment. But I had to know. Grabbing the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, I crept toward the bedroom door. It was closed, but I could see the faint glow of the bedside lamp spilling out from underneath. I was sure I hadn't left it on. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. The lamp was on, casting long shadows across the walls. But there was no one there. Then I saw it. A message scrawled across the mirror in black marker. "Let me in." I stumbled back, dropping the lamp. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but how? The door was locked, the windows sealed. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but the screen lit up with another message from the unknown number. "You look so scared." And then another. "I'm inside." I bolted out of the apartment, not bothering to grab my coat or shoes. I ran down the stairs and out into the freezing night, my breath clouding in the air. I didn't stop until I was at the 24-hour diner down the street. I sat in a booth, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was sending me creepy texts? That I thought there was a ghost in my apartment? I stayed at the diner until dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the apartment, the sun was up and the world felt less threatening. But when I stepped inside, my blood ran cold. The apartment was spotless. The mirror in the bedroom was clean, no trace of the writing. The lamp I had dropped was back on the table, unbroken. Even the curtains I'd yanked aside were perfectly drawn. It was as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, that maybe the stress of work had gotten to me. But then my phone buzzed. A picture. It was me, sitting in the diner, looking terrified. I moved out of that apartment the next day, breaking my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I stayed with a friend for a while, refusing to be alone. The texts stopped after that. But sometimes, late at night, I get the feeling I'm being watched. I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint knock when no one's there. And every now and then, my phone buzzes. I don't look at the messages anymore. I'm too afraid of what I might see.
Story number 6.
I was a house sitter. Not a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I liked the solitude. Most of the time, it was uneventful. Water the plants, feed the pets, and make sure no one broke in. But last winter, I took a job that still haunts me. The house was old, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of a small town. The owners, an elderly couple, were going on a 3-week cruise. They wanted someone to stay in the house full-time, mostly to watch over their antique collection. It was snowing when I arrived, the kind of heavy snow that muffles sound and makes everything feel eerie. The house loomed over the driveway, its dark windows like empty eyes. The couple greeted me warmly, showed me around, and left detailed instructions. They promised to call once a week to check in. The first few days were quiet. I spent most of my time in the cozy library, reading by the fire. The house was creaky, but that was to be expected with a place that old. At night, the wind howled through the trees, but I told myself it was just the weather. On the 4th night, I heard it. I was lying in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but this sound was different. It was a faint scratching, like nails scraping against wood. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The scratching grew louder, like moving across the floor. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway outside my room. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept toward the door. My hand shook as I turned the knob, the faint creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The hallway was empty. I shined the flashlight down the length of it, the beam catching on old wallpaper and faded rugs. The scratching had stopped. I tried to convince myself it was a mouse or some other small animal, but deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I found scratches on the door to the library. Long, deep gouges in the wood, as if something with claws had tried to get inside. I called the owners to tell them about it. The husband brushed it off, saying it was probably an animal. "The house is old," he said. "We've had raccoons get in before." I wanted to believe him. But that night, things got worse. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps, moving from one room to the next. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed a knife from the counter and made my way to the staircase. I could see the upstairs landing, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through a window. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood sending a shiver down my spine. When I reached the top, I checked every room. The house was empty. But in the guest bedroom, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the bed was a single handprint pressed into the dust on the old quilt. The print was too large to be mine, and it wasn't there earlier. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called the owners again, begging them to come home early. The wife sounded concerned, but the husband was dismissive. "It's just your imagination," he said. "Old houses make strange noises." I decided not to stay another night. I packed my things and planned to leave before sundown. But as I was gathering my belongings, I heard a loud crash from the library. I rushed downstairs, my heart pounding, and found the room in chaos. Books were scattered across the floor, the curtains ripped from the windows. In the center of the room was an antique mirror, its surface shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. And in the broken glass, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. That was the last straw. I grabbed my bags and ran out of the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent, its windows reflecting the snow like empty voids. But in the attic window, I saw something move. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, watching me leave. I never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call from the owners. They wanted to thank me for my time and apologize for the strange occurrences. But before the husband hung up, he mentioned something that still gives me chills. We found some old photographs while cleaning the attic, he said. The previous owners used to host seances. Apparently, they believed the house was haunted. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I already knew.
Story number 7.
I moved into my new apartment last spring. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom in an older building, but it was cheap and close to work. The landlord was an older guy, friendly enough, who assured me it was a quiet building. For the first few weeks, that was true. The neighbors were polite but kept to themselves. The only noise came from the apartment above mine. I could hear faint footsteps now and then, and sometimes the floorboards would creak. It didn't bother me. It was comforting in a way, knowing someone else was around. That changed on the first stormy night. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. A faint thump, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor above me. It was slow and deliberate, like furniture being moved. I frowned, annoyed. It was after midnight, and I couldn't imagine why someone would be rearranging their apartment at that hour. The dragging sound stopped, and for a moment all I could hear was the rain pattering against the window. Then I heard a loud crash, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The sound was so loud it felt like it had come from my own apartment. I waited, straining to hear, but everything was quiet again. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself to my upstairs neighbor. I figured if we were on friendly terms, I could politely mention the noise. But when I asked the landlord which apartment they lived in, his face went pale. "There's no one living above you," he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking. But he wasn't. "That apartment's been empty for months," he said. "I'm actually showing it to potential renters this weekend." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to believe he was mistaken, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound set me on edge, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noise to start again. It didn't. For the next few nights, everything was quiet. I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd dreamed the sounds. But then it happened again. This time, it wasn't just dragging. I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I heard footsteps overhead. They were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. I muted the TV, my pulse quickening. The footsteps stopped. Then a faint tapping sound started, like someone drumming their fingers against the floor. It was rhythmic, almost like a pattern. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a broom, I banged on the ceiling. "Hey, cut it out!" I shouted. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the apartment was completely silent. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A laugh. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it was there, soft, sinister, and unmistakably coming from above me. I called the landlord, demanding he come over and check the apartment. He sounded irritated but agreed to meet me. When he arrived, I followed him upstairs, my heart pounding. He unlocked the door and we stepped inside. The apartment was empty, no furniture, no signs of life. Just a cold, stale air that made my skin crawl. "I told you," the landlord said, his voice uneasy. "No one's been here." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was losing my mind. That night, the noises were worse. The footsteps were louder, heavier, and they didn't stop. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, for hours. Then came the whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't words, exactly, just a low, murmuring voice that seemed to seep through the ceiling. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. The voice was inescapable, surrounding me, filling the apartment. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. I sat there in the dark, shaking when I heard the knock. It wasn't on the ceiling, it was on my door. I froze, staring at the doorknob. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but when I looked at the screen, I saw I had a text message from an unknown number. It said, "Let me in." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. The knocking grew more frantic, pounding against the door. Then just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I sat there in the dark, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. The landlord found me the next morning, still sitting on the couch, clutching a knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen. He took one look at me and said, "You're leaving." I didn't argue. I packed my things and moved out that day, breaking my lease and forfeiting my deposit. I don't know what was in that apartment, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that laugh, soft and sinister, echoing in the empty air, and I wonder if it followed me.
Story number 8.
It was the fall of my sophomore year in college when I moved into an off-campus apartment with two friends, Katie and Alyssa. The building was old, built sometime in the early 1900s, and had all the quirks you'd expect. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and pipes that groaned in the night. We didn't mind. The rent was cheap, and it was close to campus. The first week, everything seemed fine. We decorated, hosted a little housewarming party, and settled into our new home. But by the second week, things started to feel off. It began with small things, lights flickering, strange cold spots in the apartment, and doors that didn't stay closed. We chalked it up to the age of the building and joked about living in a haunted house. Then Katie started waking up at odd hours. "I keep hearing someone walking in the hallway at night," she said over breakfast one morning. Alyssa and I exchanged a look. Our apartment had a long, narrow hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living room, but it was just the three of us living there. "It's probably just the people upstairs," I said, trying to brush it off. Katie didn't look convinced. The following night, I heard it too. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, moving up and down the hallway. My first thought was that one of my roommates was up, but when I cracked my door open, the hallway was dark. "Hello?" I whispered. The footsteps stopped. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. The next morning, Katie and I told Alyssa what we'd heard. "I haven't noticed anything," Alyssa said, shrugging. "You guys are probably just hearing the building settle." But Katie and I weren't so sure. A few days later, Alyssa changed her tune. We were all sitting in the living room watching a movie when Alyssa suddenly went pale. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" Katie and I asked in unison. "The shadow," she said, pointing toward the hallway. It moved past the doorway. We paused the movie and stared at the empty hallway. There was nothing there. "You're just imagining things," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. From that night on, none of us could ignore it. The footsteps, the flickering lights, the cold spots, they all grew more frequent, and then came the whispers. It started in Katie's room. She said she would wake up in the middle of the night and hear faint voices, like someone was standing just outside her door, murmuring. Alyssa and I didn't believe her until it happened to us. I woke up one night to the sound of my name being whispered. "Emily." It was soft, almost gentle, but it made my blood run cold. I turned on every light in my room and stayed awake until sunrise. Alyssa had a similar experience the following week. She claimed she heard someone calling her name, but when she opened her door, the hallway was empty. We were terrified, but we didn't know what to do. Calling the landlord felt ridiculous. What could we say? That our apartment was haunted? Things escalated when Katie's room was trashed while we were all out one evening. Her books were scattered, her mirror was shattered, and the word "leave" was scratched into her desk. That was the breaking point. We decided to stay at Alyssa's boyfriend's place for a few nights while we figured out what to do. But the night we left, I realized we might not be able to escape whatever was in that apartment. I had forgotten my phone charger and went back alone to grab it. The apartment was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. As I walked down the hallway to my room, I felt it, this overwhelming sense of being watched. I grabbed my charger and turned to leave, but then I heard it. "Don't go." It was a voice, low and guttural, coming from behind me. I froze, too scared to turn around. "Emily," it whispered, closer this time. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, my chest heaving and my hands shaking. The next day, we contacted the landlord and told him we wanted to break our lease. To our surprise, he didn't argue. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Alyssa asked. He sighed. "Tenants in that unit don't stay long. Most complain about strange things, but I've never had proof of anything, so..." He trailed off, leaving us to fill in the blanks. We moved out within a week. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but sometimes I still hear those footsteps. When I'm alone in my new apartment, late at night, I'll hear them. Slow, deliberate steps moving just outside my door, and every now and then I'll hear my name, whispered softly in the dark.